Hello and welcome to English 201. My name's Dr. MHohner and I'll be your instructor for the course. Before we get started, I want to tell you just a little bit about myself. I was born and raised Spokane, Washington. I earned my bachelor's and my master's both in English literature from Eastern Washington University. And then I earned my PhD in English literature from Arizona State University. So I'm actually a very local guy from the Pacific Northwest. I love it here, and I love Eastern Washington University. I would have gotten my PhD here as well if they offered one. Had to go somewhere else for that, and those are the only years I've lived anywhere other than the Pacific Northwest. Just a little bit more. I'm a family man. My wife and I have 5 kids. My wife is the absolute joy and treasure of my life. And so my family is the most important thing in my life. But something else that's very, very important to me and dear to my heart is teaching, which is what this course is all about. We're going to learn writing and the most effective ways to communicate, and that's a passion of mine. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. This is our first lesson, and it is called Revisiting the Fundamentals of Rhetoric. So some of you may have taken English 101 from me, and that's why this lesson is called Revisiting the Fundamentals of Rhetoric. If you were in my 101 class, you'll remember the first lesson there was called just the Fundamentals of Rhetoric. Rhetoric is a foundational concept in both this class and 101. And because it is the foundation of both classes, we're going to review what rhetoric is, why it's important, and how we use it in this lecture. So if you took 101 with me, this lecture will be very familiar. But trust me, from this point on, after lesson 1, it is pretty much mostly new material. We will revisit some other important concepts that are fundamental to both classes, for instance, critical reading in lesson 2, but for the most part, even when we're reviewing a concept from 101, the lessons will be pretty different outside of this lecture. So if this lecture feels familiar, I recommend you still watch it because it'll be very helpful to be refreshed on these things, but also know that from this point on, they'll be pretty different. So let's go ahead and get started with the actual lesson. Every lecture will have an overview, so you know what's coming in the lecture. The first part of this lecture will be an introduction to our course. So that's just learning a little bit more of what English 101 is all about. The second part is our actual topic for this lesson, which is the concept of rhetoric. So you'll learn much more about rhetoric in part 2. And rhetoric is you could say, the most foundational aspect of the class. It is the concept we will build this class around. And so that's why we're discussing it in the first lecture. And then finally, we'll have an example of what I call rhetorical analysis. So after part 2, in learning what rhetoric is, you'll then in part 3 see rhetoric in action. And hopefully make it a little more relatable, a little clearer what it is through that example in part 3. As I said, this is an introduction to the course, this first part of the lecture. As an instructor, I fully believe in transparency. I want the learning objectives and what you need to do to be successful in the course to be absolutely as clear as possible. With me, there are no tricks or gimmicks or hidden things. What you see is what you get. And that's why I'm going to take about 10 minutes here and devote this first lecture to just learning about the course. So if you pay attention in this lecture, you will know what you need to do to succeed in the class. And that should be very clear. The first slide will address online learning in general because online learning is a different beast from learning in the classroom, and it has its own things that you need to learn to be successful. And so you can take what you learn in this next slide and apply it to almost any online learning class. But then after that next slide, we'll move to the more specific what you need to know for this class. So here are these tips I just mentioned, strategies for success with online learning in general, not just in this class. Manage your time well. One of the things that's really helpful about online classes and why many people like to take them is that they're much more flexible. So if you work a full-time job, or maybe you're like me and you had a family while you were in school, you can choose when to do the work. We have deadlines. We usually have 1 or 2 assignments due per week, but that's much more flexible than coming to campus several days a week. So you can really choose when you do your work, and maybe that's the evening or the morning or the weekend, depending on what your schedule is like. And that's a big advantage. But there's always pros and cons. And so with that, you have to take on a greater degree of accountability, self-accountability, than if you were in a class that were maybe meeting on campus a few days a week and you got more face-to-face reminders more frequently throughout the week. So you have to make sure you can do the work whenever you want, but you have to make sure that you actually do the work and that you set aside enough time for it. So my class has a really similar workload from week to week. Other online classes may not be that way, but mine, you can pretty much anticipate it being relatively close. Not exactly, but approximately the same amount each week. So I would leave a lot of time aside the first week and see how long that takes you. And then in subsequent weeks, you can set aside a comparable amount of time. Next up is come up with a schedule where you reserve time to work on the class throughout the week. You probably don't want to do all of the work at once. And so if it takes you 3, 4, how many ever hours per week, probably more than that, you want to set that time aside. So if you work a full-time job, maybe you've got kids in school, which days work best for you. Maybe it's Tuesdays and Thursdays from 6 to 8 p.m. Who knows? But that's just a hypothetical but specific example. So once you figure out how much time each week will take you, block out those hours, set that aside, and make sure you do the work during that time. Maybe look early in the week at the lesson assignment page, which I'll talk about more on the next slide, so you see what exactly the objectives are for that week, and then go from there with setting aside the time. But make sure you have enough time set aside and that you follow through on that and you work it into your schedule. The advantage is you can work it into your schedule, but you've got to actually take that step. Finally, stay up on due dates and reading assignments and try to work ahead if possible. The working ahead thing is really optional, but it's an option you do have in an online class that's typically not available in a face-to-face class. But really stay up on due dates, become best friends with Canvas. You can look ahead and see when things are due. Like I said, it's usually just a couple of times we have 2 assignments per week. They're almost always due at the end of the week, so that if it's better to work on the weekdays or the weekends, you yourself can make that decision. And we do have a few parts of the quarter where there's bigger papers due the end of week 5 and week 10, like your major papers for the course, and you'll want to devote some time to those, some pre-writing, writing multiple drafts. We'll talk about all that in more detail on the subsequent slides, but I'm just giving an example of kind of the type of work we'll do and how you want to know when it is due and set aside the time to do it fully and properly. Same with reading assignments. We have a lot of reading because this is an English class, so some people read faster or slower than others. I myself am a slow reader. My wife can read circles around me. So if we were both taking this class, I would probably set aside more time than her for the weekly assignments because there is a significant amount of reading. So keep these things in mind. Figure out how much time you'll need each week, when things are due, set that time aside. And as long as you stay on your own schedule, you will do great. You will have success. But the key there is you have to set your own schedule and stick to it. As I said, those strategies are very general and could, for the most part, apply in any online class. So let's talk specifically some strategies for our class. Like I said, there's a lot of reading, and in lesson 2 will be devoted to what I call critical reading, and discuss basically this bullet point in more detail. But read carefully, reread passages that are confusing, and take notes as you read. So critical reading is just paying a little more attention, putting in a little more effort to reading things for this class and other things that are more demanding than how you might read, say, Facebook posts, or if you're like me, the news, or the news in the NFL app, the NFL news cycle, just as an example. So there might be parts of the reading that are confusing. Don't just move on, reread those. And then taking notes in the margins, which you can print the reading out, or you can take notes digitally, but writing something down helps you remember it, helps you put it into your own words to understand it better. You can take a similar approach with the lectures. Again, it would be easy to just put on a lecture and watch it like a TV show, like Netflix. But again, you're trying to learn. So maybe pause the lecture. I'll point out some points sometimes, or often I'll point out points in the lecture where it would be good to pause here and reflect on this some. Of course, take notes. And if I pose questions, you could actually pause and try to answer those questions yourself. I won't do that a ton, but I do that some in an effort to try to simulate as much as I can the learning environment of a real live face-to-face classroom. So I mean for the lectures to be more engaging and more really interactive than they would initially seem. So don't just be a passive observer, engage. Pause when you don't understand things, rewatch parts if you need to, jot down notes. You'll really absorb the material better if you do that. And finally, the reason why I recommend these strategies for both watching the lectures and reading the assigned readings is research. A lot of studies have been done, and they show that writing something down is much more helpful to remembering it than reading, hearing, or even seeing it. So we all learn different ways. We have different learning styles, but studies show that regardless of your learning style, writing something down while you're reading it, while you're hearing, or while you're seeing it will help you retain it better than if you don't write it down while doing any of those 3 things. And when you're dealing with some of the complex ideas, like for instance rhetoric, that you'll encounter in this class, it can be very helpful to write some notes in your own words, because if you rewrite someone else's idea in your own words, that shows a really clear understanding of it. And then if you're writing it down, you'll remember that. So these are just some tips to retain the material. And while they are specific to this class, since this is an English class, any class that has complex reading, which is really a good majority of classes in college, these tips would work there too. Now we're going to get really, really specific on these last couple of slides of what exactly I'm asking you to do each week. So most weeks, except when we have final drafts of papers due, we will have a weekly lesson, much like this one. And in that weekly lesson, there'll be several steps I'm asking you to do. So I'm going to go through those steps here. The first is to do the reading. You do the reading first. Second is you watch the lecture. You might be thinking about the reverse order here. You might be thinking, well, I probably need to watch the lecture first because he might be explaining the reading in the lecture. There's some truth to that, but I still uphold this order. Here's the reasoning is some of the readings will be very challenging. And so I want you to come to those readings completely fresh and meet that challenge on your own terms and try kind of, even if it's a hard reading, struggle through, grapple with that reading yourself before hearing what I think of it. So that your first impression of the reading is not influenced by what I'm giving you to help you interpret it. And even after the lecture, I still want you to really draw your own conclusions about what we read. This is a class where I value your opinion nearly as much as mine, and I'll make that clear multiple times. I'll emphasize that multiple times throughout the quarter. I really value what I think. This is not the kind of class where I want you to just reiterate to me what I say. What I say is a foundation, upon which you build. It's to get you started. So I'll do some things to help explain the reading to get you going. But when you then go and write, I want you to build upon what I've said and add new things. And I really am looking forward to hearing your opinion. If you feel like you really do need the help of the lecture to understand the reading, I think that makes sense. What I recommend in those cases is to do the reading again after the lecture, because reading it twice is really a tip that could have gone on the last slide. Reading it twice will really help you absorb it, and is good practice for any challenging text. And the readings aren't terribly long. I'm not asking you to read novels or anything. Many of them are short articles, so it is actually, even with a busy work or home life schedule, or both, you could really probably do the reading twice, many weeks. Finally, answer the discussion board question and respond to a classmate. So kind of back to just logistically the mechanics of the class. Do the reading, watch the lecture, and then I'll have some kind of discussion question that is meant to assess your learning, or that when I read your answer, it'll do two things. One, it'll show me that you've understood the material based on how you answer the question. And secondly, it will ideally, hopefully, simulate the discussion that could take place in a face-to-face class. So there'll be a question. You look at the page. Every page in Canvas under Module 1, Module 2, etc. will have a lesson page. If you click on that lesson page, you'll see a hyperlink or a PDF of the reading, because there's no textbook for the class. Below that will be a video lecture, and finally there'll be a discussion board question. So if you do those three things in that order, you've done what you need to do for that weekly lesson. And with a discussion question assesses, if you've learned that, but it also is meant to be thought-provoking. So your response will, one, show me what you've learned, and two, put forth some kind of interesting thought of your own. And then the second half of the discussion board assignment is asking you to respond to a classmate. So hopefully that'll get some discussion going. Once you've completed your post, you can see what others have written, scan through them, find someone who said something interesting, and start a conversation with them. You're only required to respond to one classmate one time, but that's the minimum. You're more than welcome to respond way more than that. And I will get on the discussion board. I'll engage some and respond some myself, and I would love to be able to go in there and see that you all are talking to each other and that we're having some kind of conversation, because the discussions are one of the best parts of a class like this, and they can be challenging to replicate online. I don't want this to just be a lecture in response, show me your learning. Again, I would like you to build on what I say with your own ideas and your own learning, and that can happen, of course, in the papers and the writing assignments, but hopefully in the discussions as well. So that might be hard to achieve in an online class, but we're certainly going to try, and this third bullet point here is my attempt at that. So that's what you do for each weekly lesson: the reading, the lecture, answer the question, respond to a class. Finally, this will be the last slide, and then we'll move on. What should these discussion board posts look like? I use the term substantive to describe the kind of post that meets the criteria and gets full credit. So initial responses should be at least 250 words. Answer the question fully. And so sometimes they will have multiple parts, or they'll be kind of complex questions, not always, but many times. So make sure you answer it fully, and then use close reading to defend your answer. Close reading, what I really mean there is evidence. So don't just answer the question and then move on. You have to show me your reasoning. Show me that whatever we've read or discussed in the lecture, you've read that closely and responded to it. That the word evidence might be a better word there. Close reading is kind of a synonym for evidence. Close reading is what we do with the evidence. And this first lesson is a little different because the only reading is the syllabus, and then I'll explain this later. You're actually meant to go find a thing that you'll analyze. So that'll be the close reading. But 250 words, so it's long enough, answers the question completely, and gives some kind of evidence or reasoning to support that answer. And then responses to classmates don't need to be as long, only 150 words, but they need to advance the discussion in some way. It can't just be, yeah, great job, I love what you wrote. It needs to, like I said, try to simulate or replicate a classroom discussion from a live class. So posing a question is a great way to do this, but there are other ways to do it. As long as you're expanding on what the other person says and kind of adding something to that pre-existing conversation that will further it, that might, other people in the class might read your response and become engaged in this ongoing thread. That's what we're looking for. So if you want the points for responding to a classmate, you can't just say, yeah, great job, or some 150-word version of that. You have to advance the discussion in some way. But that's the only criterion besides the word count for those responses to classmates. Each one is worth 2 points or 2% of your final grade. There are a couple that are worth 4 points, just 2 of them total. So most of them are worth 2 points. And for part 1 and part 2, if it meets the requirements that I've listed above, that will be a substantive post. And so you'll get, if you're 250 answers a question and defends the answer with reasoning or evidence, you get the 1 point for part 1, 2 points in certain weeks. And then if it's 150 words and furthers the conversation, you get that second point or other 2 points for part 2 of the question. And in terms of feedback, my feedback will come on your major writing assignments and probably not too much on discussion board posts. I know feedback's very important. So if you meet the criteria and you get the full points, the 2 or the 4, you won't get a ton of feedback from me. But if you, for some reason, miss the mark and get a 0, unless you just simply didn't do the assignment. If you didn't do the assignment, then it's obvious why there's a 0. But if for some reason you get the 0 instead of the 1 or the 2, then I'll give some explanation as to why, so you know how to improve for the next one. And you can always reach out to me via email or my office hours with questions about any of that. And like I said, I will be jumping into the discussion board and engaging in the conversation, so that will be a form of feedback in of itself too. And obviously, if you don't do the assignment, or if it's late, you would get 0. I do occasionally accept late work. It depends on the circumstances. The syllabus explains this. So if you ever need to turn in something late, you just reach out to me and explain the reason why, and then I'll respond back and we'll work something out. The 1 point thing there, I know that might be confusing. There's 2 weeks out of the quarter, I believe it's week 3 and week 8, I think, where the posts are worth 4 points instead of 2. And so for those ones, that's because those are a little more complex. And so for those ones, it would be possible to get half credit. And in that case, I would again give you feedback and explain why, so you know how to improve. But the majority of them will be, either the you get the credit or not. So that's how the discussion board posts work. This is really important. You want to probably jot down some notes here to retain this, so that you know how to do the discussion boards going forward. And that's it. These are the basics of the class. Anything else should be on the syllabus. And if you follow those modules in Canvas in order, you'll have everything you need to do. So please reach out to me with any questions about the class. I'm really looking forward to working with you this quarter. But now that we've gone over the basics of the class, let's turn and look at some actual content. So in part 2 here, we're going to talk about rhetoric.